Mónica Ramírez. She has for more than 2 decades fought for the human civil rights of women, children, and immigrants. And if you think in these last more than a decade, but for decades, the issue of immigrants, women, and children are at the center of the moral conscience or lack of conscience of this country. And I think Mónica has fought in good and not so good times. And it's interesting, will be interesting to hear from her in these times when so much remains to be done. But the horror of the Trump administration, I think, brought to bear for millions of Americans who had not been paying attention what is left undone and what needs to be done. Just briefly, though it's hard to be brief with a biography like Mónica's, she's a longtime advocate, organizer, attorney, fighting to eliminate gender-based violence and secure gender equity. In 2003, Mónica created the first legal project in the United States dedicated to addressing gender discrimination against farm worker women, which she later expanded to create Esperanza, the Immigrant Women's Legal Initiative of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a group many of you may know. In 2014, Mónica founded Justice for Migrant Women to provide technical assistance to lawyers, advocates, political leaders, and law enforcement on addressing the workplace sexual violence, as well as other issues confronting migrant women. She's also a co-founder of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, the National Farmworker Women's Alliance, which is the first national farmworker women's organization in the United States. In November 2017, Mónica wrote a letter to women in the entertainment industry on behalf of Alianza that was published in Time magazine and has been credited with helping spark the Time's Up movement. Mónica is a leader in efforts to build a cross-sector movement to end workplace sexual violence, and she's a prominent voice in advancing the rights of low-paid workers, immigrants, and women in the United States who've so often been marginalized in some of the legislation we value. For example, Social Security, Mónica, right at the beginning, cut out swaths of people, other legislation which we value today because of movement organizing to achieve those, but so much more needs to be done. When COVID-19 struck, Justice for Migrant Women set up a Farmworkers Pandemic Relief Fund to help those keeping America fed, putting food on our table. Last October, it organized the annual Latina Equal Pay Campaign, including a national campaign demanding pay parity. Latinas are paid 54 cents for a white man's dollar, migrant women 32. Its rural civic initiative, created to increase political representation and power of rural women, drove get out the vote efforts in tough places, states like Ohio, Florida, and Texas. Mónica's received many awards. She was included on Forbes 2018 list of 100 powerful women, Changemaker Award from the Kennedy School, Feminist Majorities Global Women Rights Award. She currently serves as the President of Justice for Migrant Women and the Director of Gender Justice Campaigns for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And I think in large measure, it's work like Mónica's, someone else we had on our conversation series, Ai-jen Poo, who have helped set up this idea of a care infrastructure, that it's not just bridges, but it's bridges to women's lives, to people's lives, to children's lives. So I turn it over to Mónica with great gratitude that you've joined us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to be in this conversation today.
So Mónica, if you would speak to us for maybe, 12 minutes or so, whatever, you choose to do, and then we'll open it up. I'll have some questions. And I know our audience, which spreads not only across this country, but often globally. And what I've always loved too, in the last two conversations, we've had high school classes. So the floor is yours, so to speak, and then we'll come back to questions.
Thank you. Last March, as the world was starting to come to grips with the fact that the pandemic was spreading and that many of us were going to be facing a situation that was unknown, a situation that was stressful and scary, one that could potentially affect many of our lives in so many different ways, from getting the COVID-19 virus to losing our jobs, to not knowing how to manage our childcare responsibilities. As all of us were coping with those stressors, farm workers across the United States were feeling the same kind of stress, the same worries, but they were also experiencing a different kind of fear. Theirs was one of not receiving information. Theirs was one of not understanding what was going on around them because people weren't providing them with the information. As the pandemic unraveled, farm workers across our country, the 2 to 3 million individuals who pick, pack, and plant the food that we ate, began to talk to us about their devastating experiences and traumatic experiences of going to work every day to pick the fruit and the vegetables that we eat and going home and not having enough food for their own families. They talked about the chaos that ensued in their households when they didn't know where to send their children and who could help with childcare. They had to make difficult choices, like whether to leave their children at home or whether to take their children with them into the fields, into those dangerous working conditions that they endure every day. This community is my community. The migrant farm worker community is the community that I come from. My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were farm workers, used to crisscross this country, doing the same work that farm workers do today. My organization, Justice for Migrant Women, knew that if we didn't move to action in collaboration and coordination with other allied organizations, there was a great chance that farm workers across our nation would be left behind. We knew that the pandemic was going to pose a lot of risk to the lives of farm workers across our country who only earn on average $22,000 a year and who still today live in terrible housing, often overcrowded housing, who are being exposed to pesticides regularly and who face so many other dangerous conditions on a regular basis, and who now, on top of these conditions, were faced with the pandemic. That's why we created the Pandemic Relief Fund, in order to help the farm worker community. We built that fund in collaboration with Hispanics in Philanthropy, our fiscal sponsor. And as we built that fund, we heard from community members that they weren't only facing food insecurity, some of them were facing housing insecurity, being threatened with being put out of their homes. You know, many of them talked about not having money to buy medicine and to buy other things that they needed, not being in places where they could access PPE or being in places where price gouging was happening. Over the past year, I think that we have seen not only the power and the resilience of our community, but we've also seen a kind of pride that has been so incredible to watch be displayed on national stages like this one, because the farm worker community was deemed and called essential by the federal government. And we were able to be in conversation with farm workers who reflected back what that meant to be called essential. For our community, what it meant was to be seen, to finally be valued, to finally have people take into consideration the needs of the farm worker community, and also to give a nod and to be grateful for the work that farm workers do, the life-sustaining work that farm workers do. Now, more than a year into this pandemic, we have big questions that we have to answer. And some of those big questions are, where do we go from here? How do we make sure that people understand that when people talk about returning to normal, that for our community, there never really was a normal. You can't consider it normal when entire groups of people like farm workers are kept out of the most basic protections in our country. It isn't normal when whole groups of people don't have access to the same rights and benefits. It's not normal when there are people among us in this country who are so marginalized and so isolated that people don't even consider them or treat them like they are human. That's not normal. And so as we think about what it looks like to go forward and what it's going to look like after this pandemic, we have to answer the question of how do we make sure that whatever the new normal is, it's one where communities like ours continue to be celebrated, continue to be cared for, and continue to be treated with dignity and respect. Part of how we will get there is by building big coalitions, by bringing in as many allies as possible, and by working directly with the community to ensure that the community is setting the agenda, sharing their priorities, helping us understand the solutions from their vantage point, and being supported by all of us. Each and every one of us are touched by farm workers because we eat. And so all of us, in my opinion, owe a debt of gratitude to the farm worker community. That's why it's so important in my mind that we actually decide as a community and as a country to get behind and support the farm worker community, because the farm worker community can't do it alone. Even though our community has been building and exhibiting power over the decades, it is clear that in order for there to be the kind of systemic change that is required, it's going to take all of us. You know, one thing that many people might not realize is that as the farm worker community struggled during the pandemic, you know, it's estimated that more than 9,000 farm workers across our country died from COVID. There's a study that was released in California that said that from March of 2020 to October of 2020, the mortality rate for food and agricultural workers in California increased by 59%. Our belief that farm workers would be left behind and that farm workers would suffer some of the greatest harm from this pandemic, that wasn't just a guess. Unfortunately, that's a reality. And there are other workers like farm workers, those who work in meatpacking plants and poultry plants, domestic workers, as Katrina mentioned. There are so many low-paid workers who have really suffered the brunt of this pandemic and whose families are now trying to deal with the harm that they have now had to endure because of the loss of their loved ones, or because their loved ones have become sick, or perhaps even have lingering symptoms related to the virus. We know that there's still a struggle to get accurate information to marginalized communities like the migrant workers across our country about vaccinations. And we know that it's also still a struggle to ensure that marginalized and isolated communities have access to the vaccination. So we have a lot of work to do to answer the question about what the new normal is going to look like, so that no community member, not farm workers or anyone else, will be left behind, and so that we actually create the kind of foundation that is required so that when crisis strikes, people are prepared to be able to move to action, hopefully much better positioned so as not to be as gravely impacted as we've seen during this COVID crisis. Beyond that, we have to answer the questions of how, as we continue to move through this pandemic, do we ensure that communities like migrant farm workers and other migrant workers, as well as other low-paid workers, receive the information that they need to be able to make decisions about their lives and how to care for themselves and their families. We have to make sure that when we talk about equal access, we actually mean equal access to information, equal access to benefits, equal access to products, equal access to protection under the law, and in this moment, equal access to the vaccination. It's also really, really important to our organization that we understand that it isn't only the physical harm that has happened to communities like farm workers and others, but there's also been an extreme emotional and mental toll that people have endured. And that's why we have launched a new project in collaboration with the Eva Longoria Foundation, the National Seasonal and Migrant Head Start Association, and the Latinx Therapy Network to bring therapy to farm workers. Our project is called Healing Voices, and we are focusing on making sure that farm workers have the support that they need now during this pandemic and moving forward, because farm workers' lives have always been difficult. They've always experienced harm and stress and face hazards. And so we need to provide them with the mental and emotional support as they endure those circumstances. But we also know that there are other kinds of supports that are needed, like how to cope in this moment. So our new project will provide both clinical and non-clinical groups to farm workers using an online format to begin with, and hopefully someday we'll be able to bring groups together in person. And I believe that this project is one that will result in meaningful change, not just for farm workers. And it's pilot. We'll be doing the pilot between next month, June to October. And during that pilot, we'll be learning about what it will take to create a strong project that could hopefully be replicated and scaled to other industries. And at the same time, while we're providing this kind of direct care and support to farm workers in Florida and California, where the project is being piloted, we will also be working to educate the federal government about why it is long past time that we have a federal standard in this country to see mental health as an occupational health and safety issue, and to ensure that workers have both resources and benefits related to providing them with the support that they need to address their mental health issues. We spend more of our waking hours working than in any other place, and many of us experience strain and stress in our jobs. And therefore, it's important that we take care of not only ensuring that workers don't get harmed at work, by being cut or, harmed by some other kind of equipment in their jobs or through some other kind of condition, but it's important that we also take into consideration the mental health of workers across our country. And so that is what we're setting out to do by building this new project. And as we build this project, we'll be answering the question about what it will take to create a project like this that we can then scale to other workforces and work hopefully hand in hand with the federal government to create a standard for workers where mental health is also seen as an occupational health and safety standard. There's so much work that we have to do, and there's so much opportunity for us to make great and meaningful change that will positively impact not only the lives of farm workers and other workers, but change that will meaningfully impact and benefit our entire country. Justice for Migrant Women is proud to do the work that we do alongside the farm worker community and other migrant women workers, but our work requires the partnership of folks like you who are tuning in and many other partners across the country. We need partnership from political leaders. We need partnership from corporations and from other individuals across this country. That is how we will be able to ultimately make the change that is needed for the benefit of farm workers, other migrant women, and for all of us. And we're looking for the opportunity to collaborate and partner with all of you now and into the future.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for describing how you see a new normal. We at the Nation have been very cautious in talking about going back, because going back is really going back. We have to go forward. And thank you for talking to us about the pride, power, and resilience of the farm worker, migrant farm worker community. There are so many opportunities. I wanted to ask, in terms of building coalitions, which you ended with, and the Healing Voices initiative is so powerful, but how do you see moving forward in a new normal to build new coalitions that may not be so visible now, but are increasingly possible in this landscape?
Katrina, I think one of the things that has happened during this pandemic, because, regardless of where we live, regardless of where we work, regardless of how much we earn, we all felt pain, concern. We all had to deal with new limitations that were put on us. And so there's this oneness that we have in this experience. And certainly there are members of the community that have experienced far worse things. We haven't all had the exact same experience, but we've at least had a similar experience. And I think that familiarity in sort of oneness in this experience, that's a new baseline that we can work from. And, I would say that one of the best examples of this is, I've spent the majority of my career as a litigator, and I've sued employers for the way that they've mistreated workers. And I could probably never have imagined a time when I would have been trying to work in partnership with some of these employers to try to help the workers in the same way that we did during the COVID pandemic. Farmers were just as critical to ensuring that farm workers had the right information and protection as it was that farm workers understood that they could trust their employers and work with their employers. And that required advocates like me to go to these unlikely partners, like employers who maybe wouldn't necessarily want to be working in collaboration with me, to say, okay, what is it? We all have the same goal here. We all want to make sure that people are safe. We all want to make sure that people are healthy. How can we pool our resources and work together to actually make this happen? That's one example. And I think that is what we will see more of going forward. And we just have to continue to be open to this idea that maybe we don't agree on everything, but there are some things that we can reach agreement on. And it's those things that we can reach agreement on that we need to build coalitions around to try to move forward on.
You were central to sparking the Time's Up movement. Where do you see that now? And how has it been important for migrant women, migrant farm workers? Because it got a lot of attention for other reasons, but those we know from our coverage of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the condition in the fields for women are just, often hard, dehumanizing.
Yeah, when the decision was made to write the Dear Sisters letter, we had no idea that anyone would actually ever read it or see it, or that it would even, reach its intended audience, which was the women in Hollywood who were speaking out about what was happening to them in the entertainment industry. And I think that what has happened through the Time's Up movement, and in particular at that moment when farm worker women were speaking out to women in Hollywood, was that we were able to actually see each other, right? And I think seeing people is really half of the battle, because when we can see people, then we can from there try to understand what it is that they need and how it is that we might be able to work together, how it is that we might be able to build together. And that's what happened with Time's Up. Farm worker women were part of starting that conversation. And I believe that farm worker women have been central to keeping that conversation going. We've seen changes happening in different industries. The women in Hollywood, they built the foundation for that organization, and they have continued to do the work and have published really important reports, have challenged studios. They've done such important work. But I have to say that along the way, they have made sure that we have continued to be part of that conversation. They want to make sure that they're getting our input, that we are helping to work on building and creating campaigns together. I don't feel as though we've ever been an afterthought in this movement as it's been created. I think that the way that this movement has been created is that there has been an attempt to make enough space for people to step in as we want to step in, and to do work in collaboration that feels right and makes sense for us. I know, for example, the Immokalee, some workers from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers have been involved in Time's Up and have been able to get some of the members of Time's Up to support, some of their campaigns. And I think that's been part of this important coalition building that we talked about just a minute ago. Like, we didn't have relationships with some of these individuals before, but now that we do, they are ready and willing to lend their platform, to lend their microphone, so that we can then lift up some of the campaigns and work that we're doing. And I think that I hope that we have been as helpful to individuals in entertainment as they have been helpful to us. And I hope that we'll continue to see that work grow and change over time, with the lowest paid and most marginal workers always at the center.
So one brief political, one brief personal question. Politically, have you found, I know the movement is so important to systemic change, but have you found people in the Biden administration supportive, understanding of your issues, as well as in Congress? Are there people who have been present?
Definitely. I mean, right after the Time's Up movement was sparked, I worked together with Ai-jen Poo, who's one of my good friends, and we created a delegation of farm worker women and domestic workers who went to Congress to talk about the changes that needed to happen to Title VII, because most people don't realize that Title VII, the federal anti-discrimination law, actually doesn't protect many farm worker women or domestic workers from sexual harassment or other forms of discrimination because of the way the employer is defined in the law. And so we took a delegation of about 200 farm worker women and domestic workers to meet with members of Congress. And we met with then Senator Harris. We met with many different members of Congress to talk about these issues and to get their support around ensuring that workers who are gig employees and those who are working in the informal sector, those who are working on small farms, are also considered when we're thinking about needed changes to the law. So we've definitely seen that kind of support. And then in terms of the Biden administration, I mean, I think one of the most visible acts of support has been the creation of this new Gender Equity Council that has been created. I know that there is a lot of desire to figure out how we can collaborate together, how we can make sure that we are educating the different federal agencies agencies about the needs of migrant women. In addition to sexual harassment, we want to be able to talk about the range of other needs and priorities. And the administration has been very open about wanting to help to facilitate some of those conversations. I know that I've met with several different departments in this new administration, including the Department of Agriculture, to talk about some of the concerns that farm workers have and other migrant women have.
Good to hear. I just wanted to ask one last question. Before we began, we were admiring your wall of powerful women,
Yes.
Sotomayor, others. And you're an inspiration, but who inspires you? Who has inspired you over time today?
So many women. Every single woman I've had the honor to serve inspires me. I'll tell you a story about a farm worker woman who literally brought me to tears during this COVID pandemic. She's a farm worker woman in Florida, and she worked all day picking in the fields. And then after she was done with her day-long shift picking crops in order to feed her family, she then went to a local organization where she packed boxes of food that she then delivered to other farm workers in farm worker camps, because she didn't want any farm worker to go without food. And she's an inspiration to me because she's able to see not only the needs of herself, but she sees beyond herself, and she's doing what she can with what she has to help those who she can help. And to me, that's incredible. And that's just an example of the way that farm workers are contributing in their home communities and around our country. And honestly, it's women like her who help to fuel and give me the energy to do the work that I do every day.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, thank you, Monica. I'm going to ask Erin O'Mara, the nation's president, to take over with lots of questions from our participants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Monica. Thank you for doing this with us. This is really incredible. I wonder if you could name one thing that's central to the real experiences of women migrant farm workers that most people just don't know.
Well, I think that one of the things that most people don't know is that farm worker women in our country have a problem in that they are often not paid their own wages. Farm worker women in our country far too often have their wages paid to male family members. And so they might be working in the fields all day or all week. And at the end of the week, their earnings are being given to their husband or to their father or to another male family member, which is incredibly difficult for lots of reasons. When you think about the conversations that are being had around immigration, whether there will be an immigration reform and whether there would be some kind of proof of employment that would be required. Well, for a farm worker woman who's not receiving her own paycheck, we worry about that kind of proof that would be required. Certainly, they're not getting the Social Security earnings that they deserve when they're not being paid their own earnings. And if it's an individual who's in a violent situation, like a victim or survivor of domestic violence, if they don't have their own paycheck, it's very difficult to imagine how they might be able to make a plan for themselves to escape that situation. And I just think that a lot of people in our country don't realize that that's something that happens, and probably don't realize that farm worker women only on average make about $11,000 a year, which is an incredibly low salary to be earning in order to be able to try to meet your basic needs in this country.
Thank you. Ann Martin has a question that seems to fit with that. Ann writes, it seems as if the federal control of entry of migrant workers into this country is a big and complex hurdle. Can you comment on the effects of these regulations on migrant women and what can be done better?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, first, I think part of this question relates to the experience of guest workers. So there is a federal guest worker program called the H-2A program that allows workers to come on a temporary visa to work. Less than 3% of all farm workers who come on those guest worker visas are women. So what we see happening in the countries where workers are being recruited to come on those visas is that gender segregation is happening. And what that means is that as women are being recruited to come to the US on work visas, recruiters are making a determination of what is quote unquote women's work, and they are directing women to certain kinds of jobs, often working as nannies, or those sorts of jobs, and not in agriculture. And why that matters is because the H-2A program has more protections for guest workers than most of the other guest worker programs. So there needs to be a reform at the recruitment level when it comes to those guest worker programs. The other, of course, is the situation of undocumented workers in our country. There are more than half of farm workers in our country are undocumented. There are about 900,000 farm worker women in our nation. So of the 2 to 3 million farm workers, about 900,000 are women, and about half of farm workers in our country are undocumented. And we need the immigration laws of our country to change. We have known for a long time that that this system is not a system that is working for all people, and it's certainly not working for the lowest paid workers like farm workers. And so the Farmworker Modernization Act is one that is being contemplated, and other conversations are happening now about how to reform our immigration laws. And we need to see that happen as soon as possible, because this is a conversation that's been going on for so long, and in the meantime, workers continue to be exploited. And the last thing I would say is that it's important for us to recognize that, like my family, there are US citizen farm workers in our country who are also migrating. So like my family used to migrate from Texas to Ohio and other places, there are US citizen farm workers who still today are migrating. And for those workers, we need to make sure that the supports are in place for them to be able to easily migrate, including having educational supports for their children who are often taken out of school early and returned to school late after the school year has started. It's really difficult for those students to have continuity in education, and we need to make sure that there's federal funding so that they can have the educational programming and resources that are needed.
Thank you. From Janet Cook. Thinking of the frontline special called Rape in the Fields, I'm curious about how your valuable work touches migrant female farm workers in the CAFOs and egg processing plants in such states as Iowa.
Yes, I had the honor of working on that project. I was a consultant on that project, and it was a very powerful film and a very important film that was made to help shed light on the situation. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with advocates in Iowa. We don't do work on the ground in Iowa, but we do collaborate with advocates in Iowa. I think one of the big roles that we have as an organization is to help, create an understanding for the broader public of who are migrant women and what are the conditions that they're suffering. We've spent quite a bit of time doing work on the narrative of who are migrant workers in our country, including these poultry workers. So I feel like that is the way that we are contributing, by being in collaboration and support of the work that's happening on the ground in Iowa, and then helping to elevate the stories of workers like those who are working in poultry plants across the country. I just recently gave testimony before the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on the civil rights implications of COVID-19. And in my testimony, I shared some of the statistics about how many poultry workers across our country have gotten sick from COVID, and have called upon our federal government to initiate investigations into whether or not these workplaces are taking the appropriate measures to keep the workers safe, including those who are line workers, because I don't know that all employers are meeting their obligations when it comes to that. And I do believe that some of the civil rights implications that we will see will relate to the failure of employers to take care of immigrant workers, Black, Brown, and Indigenous workers. And so that's another way we call on our political leaders and other leaders to use their power to investigate and improve conditions for workers like poultry workers in Iowa.
Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that it took the pandemic to begin to call migrant workers and farm workers essential, and how important that was to them. And I wonder if you have an opinion about what's happening. Why aren't farm workers widely seen as essential? And why did it take a pandemic? And what do you think the future of that is?
Yeah, Erin, that's a very complex question. I have a lot of thoughts on that. One of the reasons that I think that people don't think of farm workers, not even think of farm workers essential, people don't think of farm workers, is because our community lives in the shadows of society. Farm workers live on the outskirts of communities. Farm workers often don't even know what communities they're in or working around. They're often taken to the job sites. And so when you don't see community members, when they are invisible to you, it is easy, I think, to then ignore them, to then take for granted what it is that they contribute. And I think then it is also easy to think that if you want to enact harm on them, that there will be no consequence because no one will know, no one will see, no one will care. And so I think that it is in part that isolation and invisibility that has created a circumstance in which farm workers were not considered essential, but just not considered at all. And, thanks to the great leadership and work of the United Farm Workers over many years and other farm worker organizations, there have been great actions to elevate the experiences and circumstances of farm workers. And so hopefully, and we've seen change as a result of those actions. And so hopefully, as we continue to raise awareness about farm workers and the profile of farm workers, we can change the conditions. Related to that is this question around essential. Farm workers have always been essential, not just during this pandemic. And I think that it is our job, it is my job as an organizer to continue to sort of beat the drum around the fact that we need to always call farm workers essential, not only during times of crisis. And if we're going to call farm workers essential, then we need to treat them like they're essential and not disposable. And that means we need to finally change the law so that farm workers have the same basic federal employment protections as all other workers. Probably folks don't realize that over 80 years ago, farm workers were excluded from the federal employment protections, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the most basic employment protection that pertains to most workers in our country. But farm workers were specifically carved out of protections under that law. Farm workers are also not allowed to organize into a union under the National Labor Relations Act because we were specifically excluded. These exclusions are still on the books over 80 years later. So if we're going to call farm workers essential, let's treat them like essential and give them all the rights and benefits that all other workers have in this country.
Thank you. Is there any legislation in the funnel that addresses any of these things? Do you see anything happening and what that time frame is?
Well, I think that right now, one of the biggest efforts underway that we are part of is not just about farm workers, it's about all essential workers. And, Senator Warren and Representative Cano last fall, and I'm like losing track of time, they introduced language around it, what an essential workers bill of rights would look like. And in September, we, along with our partners at Jobs with Justice, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and other organizations, launched the National Always Essential campaign, where we're calling for baseline protections for essential workers, like paid leave and the ability to organize into unions and other organized work groups, and a range of other things. And so there is momentum around that effort. Here in Ohio, where I am based, we have a statewide coalition that's been formed, and there have been 4 cities in our state of Ohio that have adopted resolutions around the importance of supporting and extending rights and benefits for essential workers. So, that's a place I think that we should be looking towards to see whether Congress will move legislation around essential workers so that all workers who are in these essential workplaces like farm workers can be protected in the ways that they need to be, especially in times of crisis, to have access to things like hazard pay and other kinds of supports.
Thank you. I usually like to end with action and hope, but I think I want to fit it in the middle. In your opening remarks, you said that we all need to get behind the farm worker community, and I think we have a really active and activated audience who wants to do that. And so I wonder if you could remark a little bit about what that looks like, and also Lisa, and Lisa, please forgive me if I get your last name wrong. Lisa Flansreich says, I want to donate a portion of my stimulus check to migrant women. Can you let us know the best groups or organizations to donate?
Great. Well, the answer to this question, these questions are related in that, there are organizations all around our country who are doing good work on behalf of the farm worker community. through the Farmworker Pandemic Relief Fund that we created to support farm workers during the COVID crisis, we've been able to grant funds to 56 organizations in 35 states across our country and in Puerto Rico. And now we are approaching, I think we've been able to grant about $4.1 million out of that fund to farm worker groups. And in addition to that, we have this Masks for Farm Workers project that we created in partnership with our friends at Hispanic Heritage Foundation and the fashion designer Mario De La Torre and the National Center for Farm Worker Health. And through that project, we're able to provide masks, 1.2 million masks to 185 farm worker organizations around the country. So what I think is important for people to understand is that there are farm worker groups across our country, and it's important to get local. Find out who those groups are, find out what their needs are, find out how you can get involved in the campaigns and actions that they are planning, and start there. At the national level, certainly there are national actions and campaigns happening, but I believe that the closer to the ground we can get, the better. And when it comes to which groups to support, you know, as I said, well, first, I hope that you'd consider supporting the Farmworker Pandemic Relief Fund, because we are doing our best to get aid from that fund to organizations around the country who can then get aid directly to the farm worker community, including migrant women. But I also hope that you'll consider giving to those local organizations wherever you are in the country, because they need support. Farm worker organizations of all types, whether they be direct services or organizations that are building power on the ground, or legal organizations across the board, farm worker organizations have been underfunded. And so any support that can be provided will be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. I have another question from Ann Martin, who asks, how does the movement promoting eating locally affect migrant workers? Does organic farming have any positive effects on migrant workers?
Yeah, you know, I actually have I have a soapbox related to this, because you know, I think that one of the things that has happened as the food justice movement has evolved is that there's been a lot of focus on good food, and there hasn't been enough focus on good treatment for the workers who bring food to our tables. And so I think that we need to expand those efforts to ensure that, just as we're talking about needing to have good food that isn't, you know, going to make people sick from chemicals, and food that is responsibly grown, we also need to be having a conversation about who is picking that food, how are they being treated, what are we doing to support those workers? And, you know, and the support can come in all forms. It's not just what are the workplace conditions like, but one of the things that I know coming from a farm worker family is that because farm workers are often on the outskirts of communities, they don't ever feel a sense of belonging. And so part of the work that we can do as community members is to ensure that the farm workers who live in and around our communities feel like they belong and feel like they are appreciated. That would be huge. How does organic farming help? You know, certainly it's our hope that it'll limit the exposure to pesticides, so that farm workers won't continue to get sick. I know that unfortunately, there's still many issues related to the pesticides that are being used in our country, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in order to ban some of the most harmful pesticides. So I think that the more that we can look towards organic farming and farming that doesn't use those kinds of harmful pesticides, the better for all of us, for the consumer as well as the worker.
Yes, thank you. Alana asks, how do you engage youth in your organizing work and foster their leadership, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that most people don't realize is that in our country, farm worker children are among the youngest workers in our nation. So it is legal in our country for farm worker children to work without restriction as of the age of 12. And we know that many farm worker children work at much younger ages. This has been a real concern during the pandemic, because when the schools closed, many children were then working in the fields and then exposed to the harmful conditions in the fields. How do we engage with youth? You know, we've started to build relationships with farm worker youth. We are actively engaged in a campaign related to the CARE Act, which is a piece of legislation that would increase the age of children working in the fields and provide other kinds of guardrails to ensure that farm workers who are working, kids who are working in the fields have more safety protections. And so through that campaign, we also have engaged youth to be spokespeople about those issues. Last year, on the World Day Against Child Labor, which is on June 12th. So we're getting ready for that campaign again this year. Last year, we worked with a group of farm worker girls to help raise awareness about the issue of sexual harassment against farm worker girls, and did an entire campaign on our social media related to that issue, and had the leadership of those farm worker teens to help us put that together. This year for World Day Against Child Labor, we will also be continuing to raise awareness about some of these issues, and spotlighting some of the farm worker youth who are taking leadership to try to help change those working conditions.
Thank you. Can you just tell us one more time the date of the World Day Against Child Labor?
Yes, World Day Against Child Labor is on June 12th. And many organizations, including ours, will begin observing that day on June 10th. So we'll actually be part of a virtual event. We're helping to host a virtual event on the issue of child labor on June 10th. And the ILO will also be doing some things related to child labor beginning June 10th. So if you're looking for information about that issue and want to be part of some of that work, June 10th through 12th is really when the activities will be taking place in most places.
Thank you. Have another question from Alana. There's a lot of anticipation around the end of work as we know it as automation increases. How does this intersect with the farm worker community?
Well, I live in a community where almost all of the crops were hand-picked many years ago. That's why my family ended up here. Steak, tomatoes was really one of the major crops here, and now most of that has been mechanized. So we are seeing more mechanization, of course, but there are certain crops that need to be picked by human hands. And so we will continue to see farm workers doing some of the work related to some of the crops that need to be picked by human hands because they can be easily bruised. And so the crops that are turned into, like, for example, sauces or things of that nature that go through processing, those are the items that are that we're seeing more mechanization happening around. But the other items that you will see it in your farm stand, in your grocery store, those are products that will continue to be picked by workers by hand.
Thank you. We have another question from Anne, who is asking a lot of great questions. Thank you, Anne. My family has an organic farm leased to a farmer who has noted that one of the most critical issues for him is his ability to house his workers. Have land use regulations helped or hurt the efforts of farmers to provide adequate housing for workers who move from farm to farm? Is there outside support for such housing?
Yeah, my experience with why farmers find it difficult to provide farm worker housing is because there are standards in our country around what farm worker housing should look like, and how it should be built. And unfortunately, some farmers feel as though it is cost prohibitive to meet those requirements. As someone who's spent many years going to farm worker camps, I think that what the standards require are quite reasonable. People should have their own bed. There should be doors in their dwellings. There should not be standing water, things of that. They should have a roof that doesn't have holes. I think the standards are very reasonable, but unfortunately, I think that sometimes growers feel as though it's just too expensive to maintain that kind of housing. And so many people have opted to no longer offering housing. And that then means that workers have to find temporary housing in the communities where they're working, which is sometimes difficult because growing seasons, as you know, Anne, some of them can be quite short. So if you're trying to find housing for a month or a couple of months, that might be difficult. In terms of support, I think particularly during COVID, because one of the things that we have been calling for during the COVID crisis is better housing and transportation options for farm workers, because so much overcrowding happens both in the transportation and the housing. So we were calling on the federal government to provide more funding so that farmers could receive funding from the federal government to build more and better housing and to purchase more vans and other transportation options. And we have seen that there has been more money made available to farmers here in Ohio, where I am. We worked on a campaign with the governor's office to try to get more supports for farmers and for farm workers in our state. And they created a special grant program so that farmers could get aid in order to make more housing for the farm workers. So I think there are more supports, particularly in this COVID context, but there's certainly more support that is needed, but it's going to require farmers making a decision to invest in good and safe housing for the farm worker community to be able to do their work.
Thanks. Can you tell us about outreach and access to information and vaccination for migrant workers? How's that going?
Yeah, actually, outreach has been really challenging for many people around the country. Unfortunately, many farm worker serving programs had to make the decision not to do outreach to camps because of COVID. They were concerned about exposing farm workers to COVID or contracting COVID because of the person-to-person contact. Our organization did continue to do our outreach work to farm worker camps. We had to take all of the safety measures that were required in order to do that. But we did it, and it's important for us to continue to do camp outreach because of that isolation factor that I talked about. We think it's important to be able to go to where the farm workers live. If farm workers are dependent on their contractor or crew leader, that means that they might not have their own vehicle. So in order to go to the store, to go to the laundromat, or to go anywhere, they require their contractor to help them do that. And so it's not very easy for them to be able to get information from a group like ours. So going to the camps is the most effective way. And in doing camp outreach, we provide information to workers about their basic rights and resources to help them in the community. But we also provided information about COVID and, what safety measures to take, about social distancing. We also were very fortunate to have the in-kind support from Procter & Gamble and some other corporations who supplied hand sanitizer and other items, which we were able to take to farm worker camps here in Ohio, and our allied organizations were able to distribute them in other parts of the country. So as we were doing our educational efforts, we were also trying to provide farm workers with things that they needed during the COVID crisis. Now we're turning towards vaccination. And so for our organization, because our peak season is from June through September. So we will be doing camp outreach to camps around Ohio to provide that information, but we will also be doing we'll be working with the state to do mobile vaccination clinics for farm workers, and we'll be setting up mobile vaccination units in different places that we know that the farm workers frequent, like the local, Mexican store, in our case here in our town, and some other locations. For all things related to getting information to the farm worker community, it is key for us to go to them wherever they are to make it as easy as possible for them to access the info.
Thank you. How big have Trump judicial appointees been in preventing justice for migrant workers? Is there anything, are you experiencing that, and is there anything to be done?
I mean, that's hard for me to answer because I'm not currently litigating cases. And so I don't have any cases in which I've seen that happen firsthand. I also think it might be too early to tell exactly what the consequences of those appointments are. I do know, though, that our allied organizations that are working in legal services, I think it's kind of a mixed bag, in results in terms of where judges are coming down on different things that pertain to workers' rights, and also certainly when it comes to the rights of immigrants. From my position, because we're not litigating cases right now, it's difficult for me to answer that. I would say that really the best source of information on that would probably be an organization like Farm Worker Justice or one of the other farm worker legal organizations.
Thank you. I think we can fit one more question in before Katrina comes back to join us. And this is from Gia. What is your vision for a world that values migrant workers and values giving them a dignified working environment?
My vision for a world where farm workers are whole, healthy, happy, living with justice is one in which we see farm workers first and foremost as people, that we recognize their humanity, and that we understand that as humans, they deserve the very same protections and that all of the benefits that all of us deserve. And that is such a basic statement. But that is the place where we start from, because that is not the experience of farm workers across our country right now. You know, my vision for the farm worker community is one in which farm workers understand that they are valued, that they are seen, and that they are appreciated, and that they're not only valued for their work, but they're valued because of who they are as people in this world, and that there be an understanding that farm workers aren't only contributing through their work, but they're also contributing as community members wherever they live. You know, that their children are going to our schools, they are paying taxes, they're giving in so many ways. And it's my hope that there will be a day when people fully value what they do and understand that it is skilled work, and it is hard work, and it is important work, and we all benefit from them. I also hope that one day we'll see a world in which the violence against farm worker women ceases. We can't have a situation in our country where 90% of farm worker women are saying that sexual harassment is a major workplace problem for them. We can't have a situation in our country where farm worker women believe that sexual violence against them is essentially a term and condition of employment. So my vision for a better world would be one where that violence no longer exists.
Thank you. And actually, I think we can get one more question in. What are some of the most exciting grassroots initiatives that are giving you hope?
So many, you know, everything that is led directly by the community gives me hope. Being able to see the workers themselves centered, that gives me hope, because I think that there's a story that is told in our country about who is powerful. And when you look at people in our country who are poor, like farm workers, there is an assumption that they are not powerful. And we know that's not true. So every opportunity that we have to center the leadership of farm workers and migrant women leaders and to show their power, that gives me hope. In our work, as I said, the Healing Voices Project gives me a lot of hope, because I do believe that we have a mental health crisis in this country, and it is not only with the farm worker population. And I believe that if we can get this project right, that we'll be able to make important changes for workers across industries in our country, which in turn will then, I think, have a positive impact on people's home lives and community lives.
Monica, thank you so much for spending this hour with our community. And it's really been an extraordinary, informative, humane talk. And it guides us, as so many of these conversations, to what we can do. And we hope to be in alliance with you and it's just extraordinary with all you're doing, that you've set up the Healing Voices, which we should cover, and that you are doing the June 12th, the Global Day versus Violence toward Girls. So thank you so much. I wanted to just say that there's such power in the call for just dignity, and the dignity that every group, but especially those you're representing, demand. And may we not return to that normal that is often spoken of, but to a new normal, which you laid out so extraordinarily in your vision. So thank you. And I just want to thank those on the call. You know, you all have the work you're doing. So lifting up the work Monica is doing in your communities, I think, is critical to the purpose of these calls and what the nation does. And I want to say, so next on May 26th, we have a conversation on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Next week, May 19th, something quite different. It's a conversation about empire. We're not for it. Empire, and a debate, a forum discussing, sort of talking about power, Monica, but how does one redefine power in a world that has been so overly militarized and investment not going to what's so critical? And then on June, let me get my date right, we have a conversation with Daniel Ellsberg, June 2nd, the legendary whistleblower who continues to understand the moral purpose of that. So I hope all of you will join us on those days. And thank you again for coming today to hear the extraordinary Mónica Ramírez. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.